listening to Tune Dig, a conversation between two lifelong friends about the power of music, one album at a time. I'm Cliff Seal.
And I'm Kyle Stapleton. Each episode, we talk about a single album in depth, unpacking it through conversation to understand what makes it worth appreciating, and learning a little bit about life along the way.
If you're listening for the first time because we're covering an artist or a record you love, we promise you'll learn something new or gain a new perspective by the end of the episode.
And if you've stuck with us for multiple episodes, you know by now that you're bound to expand your horizons as we share clear entry points for artists you may never have tried to get into before. Today we're talking about the self-titled debut from the Allman Brothers Band, released in 1969. Nice. So, a couple of things here. One, and it didn't even occur to me to address this until you said something just before we started recording, but a lot of people, probably 9 out of 10 fans, or people who are aware of the Allman Brothers Band, think jam band. Like they go in a category now with Widespread and String Cheese and Trey and all of the Sweetwater 420 Fest stuff. And that galls me a little bit. So I'm glad that we're talking about Duane era Allman Brothers as two dudes from Georgia and refocusing the conversation, hopefully a little bit, doing a little bit of a public service in that way. This is not a cocaine and dancing in the grass band, guys.
Yeah, explicitly pre-cocaine era Allman Brothers. That keeps us in really safe territory on a number of fronts.
But in addition to quickly addressing what it isn't, I think what it is the most dead center of the Venn diagram between the two of us in terms of our musical roots. In the grand scheme of things, it's actually a pretty narrow overlap in the things we both really like to this degree. But to capture everything about like where and how we grew up, kind of our musical vocabulary, and the reason that we kind of stayed joined at the hip musically is because of this place occupied by this one band. And I don't think anybody else captures it quite as perfectly as they do. But even in spite of that, and all the many times we've like driven around to umpire baseball or whatever together and had on this record or some other Allman stuff, I have always taken them for granted. Like I haven't given much credence to how different they were or are. And it's only occurred to me in probably the past 10, maybe 15 years, what a thing they were. Like I was well into my 20s before I learned that they had two drummers, which I feel stupid even saying, but that made everything about listening to them with headphones make sense. But like 6 dudes, 5 long hairs and a black dude in Macon, Georgia in the late 60s and early 70s. And you got 2 drummers and they're like jazz and country and acid rock, and most especially blues with all this other like jambalaya mixed in. And it's some earth-shaking shit, man. It's different. And I think that's why it holds up.
I don't think it's like common knowledge that this literal record was the debut of Southern rock as a genre anyway, created for this combination of things and influences, which I know we'll talk about. But for the same reason that I think we immediately say not a jam band, because we don't like the caricature of what jam bands became because of how far away they moved from the center. Similarly, this is the center, the epicenter of Southern rock. And so whatever Southern rock became in the decades later is really different than whatever was happening here. Like this is the place from which Lynyrd Skynyrd even becomes a reasonable thing to have happen in the world.
Right.
And they even address that really directly. But I'm also looking forward to talking about Allman Brothers and also this season Dolly Parton, because there are a couple of artists that we can really pull out of our Southern heritage and say, these people were alive during the times where the South was known.
Where the South was living up to its bad reputation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It became known for being the South for a reason. And in both of these cases, these artists were bucking the trend in really specific ways, knowing that they were doing it, but doing so in a way that was always true to themselves, always true to the artistry, and always pointed people away from bigotry and racism and towards artistry and community and brothership and brotherhood and sisterhood and whatever else. It's hard to imagine, but this isn't the same as protesting the Vietnam War so much as it was, none of that shit matters, man. You got to quit separating out people like that and come together over a thing. And the Allman Brothers are such a great example of pulling influences from places in society that you wouldn't have expected a handful of white guys to be pulling things from, especially Greg and Dwayne, and just channeling those influences in a way where they weren't trying to make a statement or be self-important. Like one definite theme throughout this entire story of this band was that Dwayne was capable of being a superstar at all points, and everyone knew it, including him, and he always chose not to be.
Yeah, he told Phil Walden, ain't no ego trip, man. Yeah, listening to you say all that just now makes me think this is the closest to submitting for the Bitter Southerner that we'll ever get. So we humbly present our Bitter Southerner essay, In Search of a Better South, as exemplified by this group of dudes who lived in a commune in Macon, Georgia, and generally went against the grain, not only in the South, but in the tides of the country in every way. So I think it's important to start there, talking about where the popular culture discourse was and the sounds were at that time. So Dwayne and Greg, born a year apart in Nashville, moved to Daytona when their dad got killed in a robbery, and they spent a lot of time after going back and forth between Tennessee and Florida. Seeing their first concert in Nashville was B.B. King and Jackie Wilson, formative experience in 1959.
Yep, that's going to change you.
Yeah.
Whatever you were before, it doesn't matter. You're different coming out of that.
You saw B.B. King. That's it. So that just drew them everywhere the music was, and in a uniquely Southern way. So there's this great Dwayne-focused documentary. It's available on Amazon Prime. It's called Song of the South, which is an unfortunate name, but it is what it is. Yeah, Googling it sucks because most of it is just, what's up with that racist Disney thing?
Don't worry, they solved it, Kyle. They put up a disclaimer now before you play it on the TV. Don't worry, what you're about to see is racist, but since you know it is, it isn't.
They just went ahead and did this tweet will not age well.
I'm subtweeting my future self.
So one of the points made really early in that documentary is about the different ways that people, quote unquote, got along in the North versus the South. In the North, people were ostensibly more tolerant, and there was a certain degree of economic cooperation, but people kept to themselves. They kept to their own kind, so to speak. And in the South, Atlanta got that reputation as being too busy to hate, but generally there was more day-to-day interaction. So by mere exposure effect, Dwayne and Greg get to hear all this black music around them in the churches, in places around town, and specifically from WLAC, this radio station. It was 50,000 watts, and it broadcast, I think they said, like Chicago to Jamaica, which is crazy, like basically streaming radio for that time. But it had a nighttime R&B program, and so they were getting to hear Muddy Waters and all of these incredible blues and R&B artists.
Of course, friends, you hitched into that 1510 spot way down south here in Dixie. John R., WLAC, Soul Center, the broadcasting service of Life and Casualty Insurance Company, home office, Nashville, Tennessee. 50,000 watts of joy on the air everywhere, 24 hours per day. Let's go like this now, Syl Johnson. Here's one I dig. The record's coming on in, too. Gonna be a big thing. Take me back, baby, one more time.
And they were spending time in their own hometown on the so-called wrong side of the tracks, learning from guys, listening to records they played, going and buying records that were getting imported to only that side of town because even the music distribution was segregated at that time.
They really impressed in that documentary that it was just as strange. This was said several times. It was just as strange for there to be a couple of brothers who are long blonde-haired hippies as it would have been for them to be hanging out with black people, as it would have been to be black in that situation, and with all the caveats that should come from, and that was the white guy's telling of the story. At the same time, like it's kind of an interesting thing to draw out, because you have to peel back some of the otherwise well-deserved stereotypes of the South to really see how the Allman Brothers grew up and became the people that they became, and how it would have even been possible for them to be creating a racially integrative band without purposefully making a statement by doing so, that it just came naturally to them. And so it takes a little bit of, it's almost like suspension of disbelief to hear the story of the Allman Brothers and try to just take it on good faith that it did seem like they had positive intentions and treated human beings equally across the board, even in an entire geographic area that didn't on the whole.
Yeah, the front against long hairs is so interesting to me. You know, we both grew our hair out at one point, but it's a small but simple act of rebellion when you grow up in a small town that expects everybody to get along and go along.
I was told like I look like a lady hundreds of times. Hey, you look cute with that haircut.
Man, that was like the number one thing people went to when we were calling ball, and they didn't like the calls that you were making. It always went back to the appearance.
That's the aughts. You look like a female.
Right?
Jeez.
The early aughts have already not aged well, which is good. It's heartening.
I'm going to walk to my therapist now. I'll be back in a few minutes. Go ahead.
65 to 68, where they're coming of age as musicians, Southern stuff is not in fashion, right? So you have the rise of the civil rights movement, you have the onset of the Vietnam War, you have folk music and the Greenwich Village kind of New York dominance around the cultural conversation. There's a lot that reminds me of this moment exactly, right? That you have the woke stuff that has carved out a place and is really popular. And you know, these like kind of countercultural figures like Joan Baez, Bob Dylan, Pete Seeger, Woody Guthrie, making these grand political statements and politicizing their art and being recognized by the youth for it and embraced. But then you also had the like distraction pop. You had surf music, the Ventures and all that. And when they were playing on the local scene in Florida, in beach towns, obviously the temptation is to like, you're playing at the Y, you just want the kids to have a good time on a Friday night. That's where they got pushed at first, but they always had this thing. They always had this swing to them and the R&B undertones. And from a very young age, from a startlingly young age, Greg Allman was like a known blues singer, and he had a voice well beyond his years.
Once I lived the life of a millionaire. Spent all my money, didn't have a care. Taking all my friends out for a mighty good ride. Drinking bootleg whiskey.
My favorite anecdote from the surf rock overlap of the time, and to give you an idea of the Allman Brothers. So in April of 1965, they were playing in a band called the Escorts. They opened up for the Beach Boys. So fun fact one, okay, take 10 seconds, everyone listening, and think of a Beach Boys song. So you got that feel in your head. Yeah, just dudes with good posture being very excited to sing, right? But just like get that feel for a second.
Coiffed.
And now kind of expand that out in your brain a little bit. Think of some of the like 50s and 60s videos you've seen of just like kids dancing to surf rock and just get a good feel of that vibe. Now, the Escorts opened up and played Ray Charles, Marvin Gaye, James Brown. It's like walking into a classical music hall and playing jazz instead.
Yeah.
So not only were they specifically and purposefully different, knowing that their context didn't fit and choosing to do that anyway, but the other fun thing, which reminds me that music is dreadfully boring nowadays compared to some of the creative things that used to happen. The other opening band before the Beach Boys, the way that the openers worked, each band stayed on stage the whole time, played one song each, and went back and forth. Then the opening bands did an encore where they covered the same song at the same time and traded verses during the song beforehand. Like, it's stuff that never happens anymore.
I would push back on you on that a little. Like, I could totally see King Gizzard doing that somewhere. And just the fact that I've now linked King Gizzard and the Allman Brothers in my mind a little bit, which is something I should have done all along. Another 2-drummer band, prolific, play all the time, strictly about the music, absolutely wild dudes. They actually have a lot in common. It's like Australian.
I can see you thinking about it.
Australian Allman Brothers. Wow.
The entire room does feel like fuzz at a King Gizzard show, so I guess I get it.
Dude, it's super far out.
But I don't know. It just it really settled me to think about 2 opening bands, including the Allman Brothers, playing Ray Charles's "What I Say" back and forth on stage before a Beach Boys show. Like that really centered me to think about their path.
Especially with the purposefulness of the people in this room in Daytona, Florida, probably haven't heard this song. Maybe they did, but probably not. And so just bringing it to the masses in a not Elvis-y, making a ton of money off of it way. It was, like, to be clear, that was a thing that had happened 10 years ago, was the whole cultural appropriation around Sun Records and the 2 sides of town in Memphis. But this was a different thing entirely.
And that's really the thesis, is that it was a different thing entirely than any of that Memphis rockabilly or anything else that kind of came before it. Before we move on to probably the meat of a lot of things, like, this is why sharing music with people is important, especially foundational stages in their life. Like, this whole story comes from WLAC and that late night show that you mentioned, and people being willing to share music that wasn't otherwise accessible to an entire, at that point, an entire geographic town. So a whole part of the country gets to hear things that they wouldn't have heard unless there was this radio show with these guys running it, who chose specifically to funnel through music that wasn't otherwise being surfaced on that same radio station, much less in the culture at large. And so to me, it's hard to impress the importance of just those decisions to share the things that give us joy and that people might not otherwise be exposed to. Just giving people an opportunity to listen and hear something new and experience it differently. Like, Duane Allman was a changed human being because of the stuff that he heard on the radio and became the person that we would continue to talk about all the way through this record.
Yeah, I think when you think about things like the social component around streaming services and algorithms, that's the entire thesis of the stuff that we've done in the music industry that eventually morphed into this podcast, is betting on human connection and curation. It's like, nothing's going to have a higher success rate, and certainly nothing's going to get you out of your own bubble of things than somebody being like, "Are you sure you don't like Slayer?"
Yeah, I feel like we're pulling back the curtain on this whole podcast just a little too much. Like, yeah, we get you in here on an episode from a band that you like, but our real trick is to get you to listen to one you don't.
Oh, you like Björk? Here's Death Grips. You like Dolly Parton? Here's the Melvins.
For
next.
fans of being scared.
But I mean, yeah, that curiosity and that connection to something bigger than yourself. I think spiritually, that's probably a large part of the reason we feel such a connection to the Allmans, is these guys are huge music fans. And I keep envisioning the 6 of them as like a 6-pointed star, and they're holding like wrestling ring ropes back behind them, and they're holding the tension. And like, there's a centrifugal force in the middle that if any one of them pulls out, the sound that they're making changes too drastically in the center. And you'd find that after Duane died and then Barry Oakley died and the pull changed in different directions, they became a totally different band. But for this period of about 2 years, they're holding the center and doing this really interesting thing with the blues in a totally different way than a Hendrix or a Zeppelin or any of kind of their contemporaries around this time.
And I mean, that's literal. Like, from a musical perspective, 2 drummers and 2 lead guitarists were both strange concepts in and of themselves, but the fact that it was never one is the lead and the other is the backup that accompanies it was what produced, first of all, the incredible guitar work that's on this record. But just to double down on that idea you're talking about, like, Duane Allman is setting up this tension on purpose because it's not an ego trip, man.
Yep.
Yeah.
2 drummers because of James Brown, which is in and of itself awesome, knowing that that's an idea that could work and be interesting. 2 guitarists, like you said, trading leads. And I I think there was a really interesting thing Greg said that Duane was all about 2 lead guitars. He loved players like Curtis Mayfield, and he wanted the bass, keyboards, and second guitar to form patterns behind the solo rather than just comping. And he loved jazz guitarists like Wes Montgomery, Tal Farlow, and Kenny Burrell. But he didn't like, J-Mo said that he didn't like Jimmy Page or Sonny Sherrick. I think it's really interesting that he called that out, specifically the guy from the Yardbirds. I don't want to do that.
And even that's a fun contrast. Led Zeppelin was 4 great individuals, like pulling each other forcefully in a massive direction, and it just happened to work out. And there's interplay. We talked on our Led Zeppelin episode about rhythm sections between JPJ and John Bonham. And yes, there's interaction, but it's pure, like almost individual star power, collective energy pulling in a direction. And the Allman Brothers is just, I want there to be a stasis. I want to set up oppositional forces so that we can nail this blues, this whole idea. You can just hear over and over through the different iterations of their bands, like even the Almond Joy's cover band, where they did a cover of My Girl because they were doing a bunch of songs or a bunch of covers anyway. And like you can even just hear them trying to figure out how to settle into something together and be able to replicate it. And they never could quite do it until we get to this debut record anyway.
Yeah, I mean, the Zeppelin contrast is interesting if you're thinking of it in sports terms, whereas Led Zeppelin, to your point, is like pulling as far away from each other as they possibly can at all times and like trying to get individual shine. They are like the LeBron, D-Wade, Miami Heat, right, where it's just a star show, and Page assembled the band with that in mind. This is more like the San Antonio Spurs, where it's all about the system, it's all about the chemistry, and no one person outshines the other, and they all become stars as a result of the system. Now, arguably, you have an all-time Hall of Famer, like the Tim Duncan of this crew is Duane, but always in service of the system, the song of the jam, of pushing each other to new heights and exploring uncharted territory and just like chasing that spark, always chasing the joy. There's such a purity to all of it the whole time. And it's never more pure than this little moment right here. And J-Mo just did a long interview with the New York Times where he talked about like that was as good as it ever got spiritually for me. And I've been chasing that feeling ever since. So to talk about the immediate lead up to this record a little bit, because I think there are some musical touch points for where some of these like major sonic things come in.
Well, to me, one of the more interesting lead up points, or the kind of time that I would count as the lead up to this record. So we mentioned the Duane Allman Song of the South documentary at the beginning. It's really good for getting the long and drawn out story that kind of leads up to this explosion of the Allman Brothers.
Yep.
To me, the places where it starts to get most fascinating. So go past some of the stories we've already told of opening up for surf rock bands and getting the inspiration from R&B. There's this time starting in about 1967 to me where they choose what not to be, catapults them into what they would become. You know, as we mentioned, like in the band at the time, the Hourglass that they were in. Mm-hmm. So they get a record deal, they move to LA, and it's straight Summer of Love. So some Southern boys, right, from middle of nowhere, essentially are now out in California experiencing a ton of stuff that no one in the South is experiencing at all, right? And so
acid hippies and freaks.
An extremely long, or at least concentrated story short, right? Their first show is opening for the Doors. They're playing for the Dead. And in fact, not only are they playing for the Grateful Dead at a time before the Grateful Dead became the Grateful Dead, that I really hate. But I mean, they're opening up for this band, and they're in situations where they're getting cheered and the Dead is getting booed off the stage.
Right.
I think it would almost be unfair in retrospect to talk about them showing up the bands they were playing with. It was just clear that that was not their category.
Another thing that was interesting about that time in live music is people seemed to show up just for the bill, and like the Apollo, whoever performed that night got the adulation. They talked a lot about There's a Duane interview from 1970 where he talks about sometimes we'll play an hour and a half if we never really get it cooking, and sometimes we'll play 3 hours. It just depends on riding the wave of the feedback that we get from the audience. And that there was such an open-endedness to it in that time was really interesting. I think it shows you how still wild and free the live music experience was as that was being formulated in some of these venues across the country.
So fast forward just a year, basically, maybe even a little bit less.
That's the insane part of all of this, right? Is like once we started stacking up the dates, you realize how little time is in there. Like Duane died when he was 24 years old. So I think it's important to note, like we did with Otis Redding, who we'll come back to in a second, the density of his musicality. Like he had to be cranking stuff out every day, essentially, to leave this kind of a musical legacy behind. He had to live and breathe it.
And so I think at that point, it seems like he's playing his way towards what he really wants to do, Duane especially. And so I think we have the rare opportunity to give milestones in a musical story that are in fact just songs that really help show like, oh, Duane's stepping stones towards this album ended up being some really big rocks. So first of all, you hear a B.B. King medley that gets recorded. And you can hear the energy shift in a recording like that from the types of things that they were recording to try to fulfill record contracts.
And also, they were so burnt out on the situation in LA and the hassle that they were getting to try to be something that they weren't, that they went back to Fame Studios in Muscle Shoals to like go back to their roots and figure out how to be themselves. And so that really comes through on that B.B. King melody, which just absolutely cooks.
Muscle Shoals is in Alabama, for anyone who's unfamiliar.
It has a documentary of the same name.
Also worth seeing.
Also very much worth seeing.
So they're back in the right context. You see the B.B. King medley, and to me, that's one of the first really clear, Duane was not meant for any of these things.
Yeah, that's right.
Duane was meant for something else. He understands this on a level that other people don't. And you can really start to draw that out. And then the place where we can still hear it now, but I think everyone else picked up on it, is him playing on Wilson Pickett's Hey Jude cover, which there's a really interesting like meta thread throughout all of these covers here, where somehow they were really unafraid to do covers of songs that were still popular in their original form.
Hey Jude was on the charts when he suggested it. And I love the story of how that came to pass. He was the hired gun in the studio, but he had a reputation as being a hot hand, right? Like people knew and recognized that he was good and the work was starting to pick up. So this Wilson Pickett session was a little bit of a turning point. And they stayed back during a lunch break. Everybody else went out to a diner, but the long hair and the black guy didn't go out because they didn't want to get hassled. So they had this opportunity to like sit and fellowship a little bit. And Duane suggested, oh, hey man, why don't you try Hey Jude? And initially, obviously, Pickett was hesitant.
All of those words are bad ideas, Duane Allman.
Come on, man. In addition to the fact that you look like a hound dog, which hurts your sales pitch, that's a crazy idea. And Hey Jude has this big build at the end, right? Which Duane obviously saw lend itself to a cathartic artist like Wilson Pickett. But the Muscle Shoals approach was if you have a big crescendo, a big solo moment, that goes to the horns. Typically it's a sax solo, right? So Duane comes in and plays this insane overdriven slide guitar on a soul song and immediately cut through the noise culturally, because here's this thing that has a lot of familiarity on lots of different levels, but yet has a thing you have clearly never heard before, right? It's the total Back to the Future moment where it's like, y'all may not be ready for this yet, but your kids are going to love it. People were ready for it, though, because it sold 1 million copies, like, immediately.
I missed my opportunity to tell the story as Duane suggested they record Hey Jude, and Wilson Pickett said, Nah.
Take a sad song, make it better. Just remember to let out your skin, then you'll begin to make it better.
So at this point, Dwayne is so desired that he essentially gets signed to a record deal and told to just put together whatever he wants.
Sick.
As a guitarist, which is certainly not common now, but also not then, to just sign up a dude who can play guitar really well. In fact, and on top of that, somebody who is so good that he had been encouraged over and over to sing, and you can hear him trying to sing in these previous bands, and it's just not what he wanted to do.
Yeah, that's right.
And so someone was still, not just someone, help me out with how it ended up with Phil. Because it wasn't Phil who immediately signed him, right?
Yeah, that's right. The people at Fame Studios got in touch with Jerry Wexler from Atlantic and like played it over the phone, like, it's your cousin, Marvin Berry. And sorry, the Back to the Future stuff all works here. But Jerry Wexler was like, yes, I want in on that. He bought out Dwayne's contract immediately. And then Phil Walden, who had been managing Otis Redding up until his death in 1967, was starting a new label that was a subsidiary imprint of Atlantic. Otis Redding had been on Atlantic. Phil Walden, also from Macon, Georgia, like Otis, was going to start the label and base it in his hometown of Macon. And that label was called Capricorn. And he bought out the rights to Dwayne, if you will, from Jerry Wexler. So immediately, in addition to all the session work that he's cut with Wilson Pickett and with Aretha Franklin and with King Curtis and all these other people, his pedigree has now been amplified because two of the biggest names in soul music, in Jerry Wexler and Phil Walden, have taken a shine to this kid.
So that's happening. And meanwhile, to overlay it with another important milestone in history, the other moment in history to overlay, which to me, this is my biggest takeaway as someone who's already an Allman Brothers fan. One of the things I had not focused on was we only got a Dwayne Allman who had been playing guitar for a few years, who would become known as one of the best slide guitar players ever to this day.
Who like popularized the style.
And he had
almost
only
single-handedly.
learned it a couple of years ago.
Right.
Whatever he put his mind to, man, he could concentrate and get on it. Yeah.
I gotta tell you, somebody learning to play slide guitar is not a pleasant thing to be around. I'd rather hear cats fighting. And we'd always carry an extra guitar around just for him to play. It was tuned up special for him to play on. And we'd be riding in the car or sitting around an apartment or something, and he'd always be playing on that thing, and we'd all run the other way.
So there's some clearly exaggerated, if not mildly exaggerated, version of the story of how
Totally a
Dwayne starts playing
mythology
guitar.
around that. Yeah. To hear Greg tell it, like he got a bottle of Coricidin pills when he fell off a horse, and a day later he had used it, and now he was this amazing virtuoso slide player. But again, in that documentary, the other people he played with when they were out in LA and the Hourglass contradict that a little. It took a little more time, but alas, not that much time at all in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah. But if that mythology in some way actually happened, in some version of that story, and then for everyone who has seen someone play slide guitar, like many of the slides, I don't know about most anymore. I haven't surveyed people lately, but you see a couple of different types of slides, and one of them is like essentially just a round piece of glass that fits around your ring finger.
Right.
And I mean, that's just like a modern capitalistic version of a broken bottle.
Of a pill bottle.
Of a glass bottle. Yeah. That came from Dwayne. Like Dwayne popularized the entire idea of a glass ring finger slide to play guitar with. And that was all inspired after, again, all leading up in the mythology, but it's fine enough to tell as is. Like Greg gives Dwayne the album of Taj Mahal.
Self-titled debut.
Self-titled, which we should do a lot of. You should also listen to this record type asides here.
Yeah.
Taj Mahal self-titled is an awesome one for a couple of reasons. One, because it's incredible on its face. Second, because I think it gives a really interesting bit of production contrast with how the Allman Brothers ended up being recorded, how the different mixes and masters ended up of this debut record, because a lot of what you hear from the actual sound of the Allman Brothers debut is a really thick and chunky sound that you definitely don't hear on Taj Mahal. Yeah. And in a lot of those blues recordings from the 60s, it's real. Everything is really thin in an effort, I think, to allow like a very mid-range or trebly guitar to stand out. And so they thin everything out. Whereas, again, everything kind of revolves around this idea of the Allman Brothers trying to do a singular thing together.
Right.
And so that sound changed because
bleeds.
Dwayne doesn't need to stand out, which of course leads to him naturally standing out. He's a standout on every track. But that's just like a great musical aside to go down, right? So Greg gives Dwayne the Taj Mahal self-titled. On it is Statesboro Blues, which was a Blind Willie McTell song to begin with. But then Taj Mahal does this version of it and he plays slide guitar.
Blind Willie McTell from Atlanta.
So Blind Willie McTell, Statesboro Blues, Taj Mahal covers it, Dwayne hears it, and essentially extends that guitar playing into an entirely new style of guitar playing based purely on his curiosity after hearing a record that his brother gave him for his birthday. Like, there's a really special relationship between brothers, especially up to this point. And that it's another reason why it's a fruitful and worthwhile effort to hear a lot of the backstory, because it's really genuine. And it also helps you, I think, to, and not to be overly dramatic, but it helps you to feel a little bit of what the loss of Dwayne would have been for Greg,
right?
When that did eventually happen.
Yeah, I didn't think until you just said that about the nature of the impact of Jesse Ed Davis, Taj Mahal's guitar player, on taking one kind of core idea from another person and making it your whole thing. So in a way, Jesse Ed Davis was like, for Dwayne, what Chuck Berry was for the Stones. Here is how I learned the whole language. Like when kids learn from their parents and that's how they get an accent of a certain kind. It's exactly like that. But they also saw him at the Troubadour when they were out in LA. So he got to see Jesse Ed Davis up close and observe the style and like was wrapped with it. And then the Hourglass, when they were in LA, started covering Statesboro Blues, and that just became a fixture for every iteration of what Dwayne was involved in from that point forward.
So many of these moments are worth drawing out because it really helps connect the musical lineage of things. Like, this is the walk back from Freebird. Freebird is an extremely well-known slide guitar song, right? All those stupid bird noises, right? That's all slide guitar, right? That's all technique. But even like the main riff at the beginning, all that stuff, like heavy slide guitar, Lynyrd Skynyrd was directly and specifically influenced by Dwayne Allman.
Most times when they played it live, Ronnie would say, "Play it pretty for Dwayne."
Exactly.
That was my introduction to the Allman Brothers. Like,
so I
listened to both bands. That was my both kinds of music in my household was Skynyrd and the Allmans, but I didn't make the connection. I also thought they were peers because I listened to them simultaneously as a kid. And again, didn't learn until I was older that like the Allman Brothers preceded everyone by a lot. And I was a little salty about that for a while because I was always more drawn to Skynyrd, a little bit of a harder edge on that stuff. But they idolized the Allmans and specifically Dwayne.
Those are the moments to me that make music so worthy of awe still, because even if it felt like I was forcing a point earlier about WLAC, like here's another moment where sharing music changed history in a literal way, right? Like Freebird is based on
In
the
a
way.
good way.
Yeah. Freebird exists as a song because they were inspired by Dwayne Allman, who heard it as a song because his brother Greg gave him a record, which Greg probably learned about through being exposed to that type of music at all. But like, then you're just hearing the blues be passed along exactly in the way that the blues forefathers would have wanted it to be passed along.
That's right.
Regardless of whether they would have known or approved of the end result. Like that leaves me in those moments where I can just sit and love music and its purity on its own. Like books and like art and anything else, like the mere act of sharing it changes the trajectory of people's lives sometimes, and you just never know until you do it.
And speaking of the purity, I think the thing that probably surprised me the most as we were doing our homework, again, this is as familiar a record to us as we could possibly cover. But the main thing that blew me away was the timeline. So I want to run through really quickly the timeline of how we have this group of 6 people in place, and then this record comes out. So Dwayne gets the edict from Phil Walden to quote unquote start a power trio in the style of Cream or Jimi Hendrix.
This next part.
And he was like, no, man, ain't gonna do that. So he doubles it. Like, no, I don't want 3 people. I want 6 people, and I need $100,000 in 1960s money for gear.
We're going to call it heavy whipping cream. You're welcome. That's free.
So he gets Dickie Betts and Barry Oakley from a Jacksonville band called The Second Coming. He was down in Jacksonville doing session work. Dickie Betts, not to be sneezed at in the conversation compared to Dwayne, absolutely 100% made Dwayne what he was as a guitarist, complimented him in a great way. And the core of this band is 2 equals on the guitar, which again was an unprecedented thing. And Barry Oakley, a very tasteful, tuneful, melodic bass player, very much in the like stack soul, but also great kind of country flavor. And there are some great tone moments for him on this record as well. Then from his session travels, he gets J-Mo Johansson, J-Mo's his nickname, and Butch Trucks, 2 drummers. J-Mo toured not only with Percy Sledge, but also with Otis Redding in 1966. He's got the pedigree. A lot of the jazz influence comes from J-Mo. He introduces Coltrane to the group, and that is pivotal, especially as more time goes on and they get into records 2, 3, 4. So March 20th, 1969, they have this first jam with the 5 people, but it's instrumental. And somewhat infamously, at some inflection point in this jam, Dwayne went to the door and said, if anyone wants to leave this room, they're going to have to fight their way out. Because they all knew what they had.
Like, it's such a good Southern boy energy moment. Like, we rarely get to look back on history and just point at somebody and be like, as a good old boy right there, doing the Southern thing, this is it. Literally, like, I can tell that's not mythology. Yeah. I know he stood in front of that door and meant it.
Oh, yeah. Man, we got a good thing going. Anybody tries to mess it up, I'm going to whoop your ass right here and now. I'll give you a ride back to your mama's house, but...
Tell me I won't do it.
Bet I won't. Bet I won't. So that's March 20th. 6 days later, after getting called up by Dwayne and convinced to come back from L.A., just kind of like break the remainder of his L.A. contract, Greg joins in because they knew the missing piece was a really killer singer. They had Reese Winans jamming with him for a little while. He was a keyboard player, also from the area. But Greg was a killer keyboard and organ player. And so when Greg joins the equation, Reese is kind of out of the picture. But I love this because this is my birthday. On March 26, 1969, Greg said, I walked into the rehearsal, March 26, 1969. They played me the track they'd worked up to Muddy Waters, Trouble No More, and it blew me away. It was so intense.
I don't care how long you're gone. I don't care how long you stay. But good kind treatment go bring you home someday. But someday, baby, you ain't gonna trouble poor me.
And the anecdote goes further. He talked about there's no way I'm up to the task of singing on this song. And Dwayne wrote out the lyrics for him. And Greg allegedly hadn't heard it, like Otis Redding doing Satisfaction, and just ripped through it kind of at its own cadence. Greg is a blues singer. cannot be understated enough. Like really, really powerful force. And I'd encourage you to listen loud and spend one of the iterations where you're going through focus just on Greg's voice, because as a 23 or whatever year old kid, to have this depth and this amount of pain and grit and gravel in his voice and his timbre and his delivery is like, it's insane. The dude has an insane voice. One of the best singers, I think, in the history of rock and roll. So that's a 6-day span. And then 4 days later, they have their first gig at the Jacksonville Armory. 10-day span, they jam, they have their first gig. And this is, I love this. They thought about calling themselves Beelzebub, which was like a name that they threw out because this is a beast of a thing. I don't know. There's no explanation for why that was the name that they landed on. But they mostly didn't even go by a name early on. Like they didn't give a shit about the marketing of this thing. It was just about the dudes and the jam. They were referred to locally as like the band's playing tonight, or hey, the boys are playing down at the discotheque or whatever.
Dang old hippies, man.
Hey man, the long hairs. Them boys aren't going to be on down there. So that's a 10-day span in March. And then May 1st, they relocate to Macon, the headquarters of Capricorn Records under Phil Walden. They're the first band signed to Capricorn. They lived in a communal apartment in their manager Twigs Lyden's name, 309 College Street. This was before the Big House. If you don't know about the Big House, the Allman Brothers Museum, the communal house where they eventually lived, encourage you to read up on it. And they lived off the kindness of a woman they called Mama Louise. Louise Hudson from H&H Soul Food would give them free plates. And then there's great stories around how they would go back and pay her when they got money from tour. So a really cool, like supporting local artists, barter economy in that regard. They spent a lot of time at Rose Hill Cemetery, just like being stoned on weed and wine and shrooms and playing acoustic guitar and coming up with ideas and talking. The song in memory of Elizabeth Reed was based on a headstone that they saw at Rose Hill Cemetery. So place-based can't be understated enough. Can't be overstated as an integral part of their thing. So when we talk about the South, it's not just bias or an implicit pride of where we're from. There is a component of that, certainly, but the place, the regional conditions certainly contributed heavily to who they were. So May 1st, they relocate to Macon. May 2nd, they have their first Macon gig at the discotheque. And they spent the summer driving back and forth places, but mostly to Atlanta to play free shows at Piedmont Park. And the first one that they played, they just set up on the stairs, totally Rogue style, like a generator party. And Colonel Bruce Hampton, who was like a jam band, weird rock and roll figure, especially here locally in Atlanta, like a little bit of a like counterculture icon. He said, to me, those Piedmont Park shows were as good as they ever got. They were on fire. The intent and the essence were there. It was just pure as hell. You could feel the purity and the fire and the intensity. Nobody was playing checkers or talking business. This was music for music's sake. The chemistry of putting all those guys together took them to a different level. So that takes us through the summer in '69. And then August 3rd to August 12th, they have time slated at Atlantic Studios up in New York City, trying to record with the legendary Tom Dowd, who we talked about on the Otis Redding episode as well. So trying to live in that lineage. Wound up getting the house engineer Adrian Barber to record it. And J-Mo said, we played them songs hard from May to August, and we walked in the studio having them down cold. They booked us for 2 weeks, and that was just supposed to be laying down basic tracks with overdubs coming later. We went out on Sunday night to get sounds, went back Monday night to start cutting, and came out Thursday with the whole thing done, overdubs and all. We went in there, played our asses off, and that was it. We were done in 4 days, and they spent the rest of the time mixing. 9 days in total, and then November 4th, 1969, the record is released, and they keep on the road.
To no immediate fanfare.
That's right. Sold 35,000 copies or something abysmal.
Yeah, abysmal related to what they would end up being clearly capable of doing.
That's right.
It's always funny to go back and be like, well, the debut record, was pretty much flat. Ooh, okay, well, the top 50 bands in the country for a little while, but not to the level that I think the people who believed in the Allman Brothers understood that they could be capable of.
Including themselves, especially themselves.
Totally. I also think one thing that really stood out to me too about this specific moment, so we've touched on this a little bit, and I think it draws out something that's a little scary to draw out. We talked about them being the hippies as it is, and there was apparently a pretty good-natured fascination with their general presence in Macon. Like, again, just to reiterate, no one looked like that in Macon, Georgia. The reason they could be known as the band or the boys is because people understood they were implying, the hippies, like the only guys with long blonde hair walking around in like a multiracial group of people who seemed to be getting along. Like all of those things in and of themselves set them apart. And I think that one thing that's interesting here that we wrestle with being from the South in 2020 is it's important to remember that many people who would have been fans of the Allman Brothers at this time, because of the details I just said, would have seen themselves as being explicitly anti-racist in this environment. That this would have actually been a collection of people who, because of how the Allman Brothers were not only clearly in a multiracial band, but also seems to be backed up pretty consistently from all sides, that they never spoke negatively about other people and other races. Like, this was a consistent thing and was apparently really well known. And so I think it's an interesting thing to remember that the genesis of Southern rock, which we're more or less saying is starting right here and right now,
That's right.
would have been accompanied by a number of people who were living in places like Macon, Georgia, in the deep South, who would have at that point been countercultural enough just by identifying themselves as fans of the band. And so I think
Literally progressive rock in that sense.
Yeah. Southern history deserves its reputation. But it's also important to remember that when you encounter, especially some of the older folks who don't really think of themselves as anything less than very progressive, that there are these pockets in society where they could have been a part of something like this culturally. And for all they knew, they were doing the revolutionary thing. They were, in fact, against the grain of what the South was doing or how it was perpetuating its own terribleness. And just connecting that possibility for some people with that through line of, and the Allman Brothers therefore created Southern rock, which was therefore built on and then became the genre of music that would in some ways glorify things like the rebel flag. Right? Kind of logically and culturally walking through those moments, it doesn't excuse the pain that comes from glorifying a symbol. It's not okay. It hurts people. And as we'll talk about in the Dolly Parton episode, there are totally reasonable ways to respond to people who say, this is offensive to me, and you can do it. But it can give you a little bit of context for why some people could be confused about these symbols don't mean that to me. And so I think it gave me in this scenario, especially as somebody who really, I feel like as a person, I want to help drag the South kicking and screaming more and more out of its historical perspectives and more into something that unifies a country and a world together. But this gave me pause. Like, that moment of connection helped me remember why it might be genuinely tough for some people to accept that they still need to do more. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it touches on an idea that you and I were talking about over the past couple of weeks. It dawned on us at some point how much the narrative of the Allman Brothers relates to the narrative around Outkast. And we're using that phrase, the South's always had something to say. And I think for all the ways Outkast reflecting the possibilities of the Black Mecca of Atlanta and extending the civil rights conversation by putting Atlanta's cultural influence on full display, you have a similar thing happening here, right? Like the racial integration stories, the stories of possibility and hope that we've told have all been Southern stories. We talked about Booker T and the MGs. We talked about Otis Redding. We've now talked about this group. We've talked about Donald Glover and how he's transcended culturally and done it by being explicitly blacker all the time. Again, I know we have this biased lens, but I think because of the unique conditions of what happened here historically and the way that we have to rectify that still and heal as a country, the South is still the petri dish to figure out, all right, we broke it real bad, but this should be the lab where we figure out how to fix it. And, oh, by the way, we've had these luminaries all along who have shown us the path forward to a better South, to a beloved community, to a more perfect union. And it's just so perfectly exemplified here by this group of 6.
Yeah, and you even see that play out in a simple way with any interviews where Duane was talking about his own genre of guitar playing. He referred to himself and others as white blues guitar players.
Right.
It was always prefaced with white, and blues was therefore by default coming from the Black community, and like that sort of respect. And again, he never seems to be making a statement, trying to overdo anything. Like he just has that level of respect for other people. And so I felt it was worth sitting and touching on that, because this is a complex time, a complex culture, a complex geographic area, all sorts of things. And because of where Southern rock and Southern culture ended up, it might be sometimes a little scary to look back on moments like this and say, I love that record. But I felt like it was worth drawing out those details so that we can say, yeah, there are times you need to be sensitive and aware of how things are affecting other people. And not everything was perfect here, but there was a lot of positivity, a lot of unification, and a lot of good intention that was here inside of this group of literal brothers. Like the Allman Brothers were not just a literal reference to Greg and Duane. It was about the feeling of the band. It was brotherhood.
Yeah. I think that's one of the things that heartens me the most about young people these days, and I don't really count myself in that category anymore. You know, we went and saw the Free Nationals, Anderson .Paak's band, and the diversity on stage was one thing, but the diversity of the audience too, and the diversity of sounds that they were bringing, like that sort of melding that's come from the flattening of sounds and genres because of the internet and the exposure to worlds outside of your own has been amazing. And I think now that we've had 10 years or so of the social internet, we're starting to see the yield of that. We're starting to see the fruit of that experiment. And I have a lot of heart that, like, while the Allman Brothers thing was such an anomaly, and it seems like it's so worth harping on to really deeply understand in its time and place, I want to give young people their due that this is just normal for them. It's such a normal part of youth culture now, that blending. And what do you mean?
Yeah, being a decent human being is societally acceptable again.
Why wasn't that always the bar? Stupid boomers.
Thank you for indulging me there. The Allman Brothers is so deep, as you and I have talked about. And so to me, this is one of those places where it's really worth, even if I'm overdoing it, just trying to sit and be sincere about having done the work to look into the origins of this music, these people, and where this comes from. And that's why it's still to this day worth enjoying and reveling in the energy that came out of this group.
Here's the thing. Here's why it's warranted. Because when you listen to this record, the blues power is undeniable, right? The feel, the amount of feel on this record hits you so way down deep that you need to go to a spiritual mountaintop type of place to understand where did they go? What have they been through to draw from this kind of a place? And again, they're kids. The sound of this record belies the age of the people who made it. So it comes from a powerful place where they're taking a lot of stuff and they don't have to say a lot about it. Lyrically, there aren't a lot of words on this record, right? A lot of repetition, very simple blues patterns. Ostensibly, they're singing about one thing, kind of a blues trope, but it's really kind of about something else a good bit of the time. So I think you almost need to understand bigger stuff around it to understand why you get walloped so hard when you listen to this thing.
Yeah.
But musically, so I mean, we've touched on there are 6 stellar essential musicians that are all equally important to this formula. And when you dig into the actual sonics of the record, there are lots of moments that reward familiarity, right? It's one of those classic repeat listens will yield new gems all the time, and really focus listening. So listen to it enough times to get the basic grooves in your head, and then listen with headphones or really loud on vinyl with analog equipment to hear the depth and hear some of the things bubble up from the bottom of the lake. The thing that I didn't know, again, until recently, is that so there's the Adrian Barber mix, the original mix, the only sound of this record that I'd ever known. But then it got remixed in '73, kind of reverse engineering with applying the sonics of what they would become.
Yeah, apparently they didn't love the original mix.
That's right.
Yeah.
They cut it in 4 days. I want to be clear that the way the original mix sounds is essential to getting it, right? It's, you said thick. It's real syrupy. There's more low-end funk, like the kick drum is way more pronounced, but it's all more in the middle too. Mm-hmm. It's a big bell curve. It bubbles in the middle, right? It's just a super thick sound. The guitar is more fuzzed out and more prominent. Nothing really cuts through. And then there's this 1973 remix that I read somewhere that they had Tom Dowd do, but wasn't able to verify that. Tom Dowd doing their later stuff, the guy they tried to get for this. It's got more, the remix has more of a like Blue Note, sophisticated. There's space, there's separation. Things come in and out of the mix more thoughtfully, more tastefully. It's more subtle. It doesn't hit you like a wave of humidity like the original mix does. And the main thing about it is like the guitars are pulled down and away some. And I think it achieves more of the what Duane had in his mind of it's really like listen to everybody in this, but it is pretty different, pretty noticeably different when you listen to one song and then listen to the remix of that same song. And normally I don't fall down the rabbit hole of 2004 reissued and remastered. Like the distributors have been doing that with classic rock artists forever. And unless it's Jimmy Page himself doing the remix, I don't care for some other studio hacks interpretation. But here's a place where it's warranted.
Yeah. General rule, the newer remix sounds better, but not necessarily the case in this.
Right.
In this. And especially because it happened so soon afterwards. Honestly, it feels like maybe some production experts spent a couple of years going, all my brothers did 2 drums and 2 guitars. They're in the same sonic range. Whoever did this had no idea what they were doing. And they just like thought about it for 2 years and then they were like, give me a crack at it, man. I can do this. I can do this. I can make them sound separate. But speaking of hitting you, one of the things I love about this record sonically is immediately the very first song, Don't Want You No More, comes in. You don't even know if you're on a downbeat or an upbeat. There's like multiple ways to listen. No, and even listening to the original version of the song, because this is like an instrumental cover of the original song.
It's like a reimagining, really.
Right. Yeah. Even then you can hear them like, it's like Duane found that guitar riff and was like, man, that riff could be a lot cooler, man.
And by the way, that's a Steve Winwood lick. That's not some slouch. It's a Spencer Davis Group song. And to Duane's credit, I didn't know until researching that was a cover. That was not an original composition that they did, but it absolutely smokes the Spencer Davis version.
And then it's such a deeply meaningful choice to me that, first of all, the first song you ever hear from this band is instrumental. Mm-hmm. When they're obviously hiding a gem in his own right in Greg away for an entire song. But it pays off in an incredible way because then the entire intro song ends up being a setup to drop out, Greg come in. And like I wrote down in my notes, because one of the ways I prepare for our episodes, right, is I know that we both just listen to the album in a ton of different ways, right? Mm-hmm. We always say we're trying to get it to hit different every time. And in one of them where it was just like, I'm not allowed to do anything, put on the best headphones I have and just focus. I just wrote down like, the feeling you get when Greg comes in on It's Not My Cross to Bear should be the new Prove You Are a Human of web forms. Like, if you can listen to this and not be emotionally changed by the blues of the whole thing and how it comes in and how Greg hits when he starts singing, you're broke.
It's very in the spirit of James Brown that the band comes out and starts vamping and then the singer comes out and you get 2 separate moments in a great soul experience where when Don't Want You No More drops in, you're like, woo! And then Greg comes in and I mean, he howls and you're like, the biggest dude in the world is the only thing capable of making this noise. It's a guttural blues roar, and it's a second bigger, like woo, like shit, whatever this is, man, I'm here for it.
It's just so heavy. And this song is also a great litmus test for the Allman Brothers as a band and their depth of understanding of the blues. Mm-hmm. So this isn't just some kind of interpolation of blues progressions or styling, but the important thing here is like this song particularly shows how it's like the white space in a song is the blues. The way that they choose to drop out, they use silence, they spread things out, they make it slow. Everyone has this feeling of pulling a moment and stretching it out into infinity inside of this song.
And they swing so hard.
Yeah. And it's a really great moment to help you know the rest of this album is about to be a trek in a knowing way. Like you have a trusted guide. It's like going on a hike and finding out whoever it is like lives up in the mountains, like for real, like hang dries their clothes on the tree and shit. And it's in and of itself is an expressive microcosm of their approach anyway, because not only do you have this dreadfully dramatic and heavy blues song, but by the end of it, you still have what feels like a broken fragment of a recording that made it into the record anyway. So I come back and it sounds like somebody sliced in a live cut from Hendrix before it goes on to the next song.
The feedback and the drum rolls. Yeah. And then you go into Black Hearted Woman from that, and you hear these guitar harmonics. Subtle, they're playing the lick at different intervals, but that would become a signature part of their thing. And they would space it out. I think the best you're ever going to hear of that move is Elizabeth Reed, right? Became the signature staple live. Definitely my favorite Allman song, but you hear it in the way they drive. Like the Black Hearted Woman riff kind of flips over and over on itself. Dun, 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 and just has a meat and potatoes beat behind it. We talked about the elements of Björk sonically, how when she would do more of one thing, she'd pull the other thing back. Here, where the riff drives the rhythm in Black Hearted Woman, the drums pull back and do more of a meat and potatoes thing. And those elements vary in their presence at different places. And that's where the jam thing came from. They just very intuitively knew when to pull in and pull back and create dynamics in the music.
And like two things to highlight here that they do musically that helps you listen to the rest of the Allman Brothers too. So what you're referring to as meat and potato drums, though, is like they basically cut, copied, and pasted a funk rhythm and stuck it in there. Listen to in your head, like play through the verses and the intro even in a standard 12-bar blues like drum riff. Like it's literally it cuts the percussion in half. And so it slows the whole thing down. It would make the song itself feel slow. Whereas a lot of what they do on this album as a whole is they bring funk as a mechanism for making everything feel faster and more lively so that the slower songs feel way more dramatically slow. It would have been really easy to make this a more standards-based, so to speak, blues record, but it would have felt slow. Whereas at the way that they did it this way, they're able to even have a song like Dreams in there later on, which is like long drawn out and almost like a medley. And yet this whole record is at 33 minutes. It's practically a punk record.
Right.
So that's one great thing to pay attention to, I think, is the way that the percussion changes what normally would have been behind a blues band. The second thing, which can be applied to any other time that both guitarists were playing harmonic lines together. If you've never played guitar or if you don't play guitar well, it is impossible to sound that together with another guitarist playing a riff. It requires an amount of practice and repetition with another human being that it would wear you out, right? Even J-Mo talked about, like, before they recorded this, like you said, they just played it for months on end until they were ready to just rip it in the studio in 4 days. And so that's even more to their credit. Not only that they were good enough to cut a record, but that, again, they were doing something unique and difficult And they were able to do it in that amount of time.
And just made it their core thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, it takes psychic chemistry to stay on a page with somebody. That's the best parts of jazz, right? When multiple people lock in on a thing in the same voice and it becomes like a spiritual type of thing.
It's exactly like jazz.
Yeah. And learning about most of the melodic lines coming from Dickie. Like Dickie was a really melodic country influence player, thought specifically about the notes and the runs and building melodies out of the guitar line. And then Duane having this perfect pitch and the ear for harmony would come in and wrap around it. But that they had that kind of intuitive relationship to be able to go beyond call and response and integrate with one another is really, really powerful. And again, to keep that up, one, in the core of the way that they wrote songs, but then also for long periods of time when they would play, 90 minutes, 2 hours, 3 hours, when they would lock in, like achieving that nirvanic swirl was the thing that they were going for all the time, was to reach that part where the whole is greater than the sum of its parts and just keep pushing back up to that place.
One really helpful aside, I think, too, because by choosing the Allman Brothers debut, we're implicitly choosing not to ever do Brothers and Sisters. So one, especially for the people who are interested in guitar playing and guitar lineage, Dickie especially was really inspired by Django Reinhardt, who inspired countless guitarists. But his melodic phrasing and the way that he played inspired other people to think differently about the guitar. And just to encapsulate what should be a podcast on its own, Django Reinhardt had an accident and was unable to use 2 of his fingers on his fretting hand. And so he developed the skill and technique to become an influential guitar player with only 2 of his fingers. And just to kind of like jump down the line a little bit, and this is why I mentioned Brothers and Sisters, Jessica, which practically everybody knows, especially if you've ever gone to a car race of any kind. That's one of my favorite guitar songs of all time. Dickie wrote that to honor Django Reinhardt. Jessica is able to be played with 2 fingers on your fretting hand, which is pretty wild because it's a long, drawn-out instrumental guitar solo.
And it's got notes, bro.
And it's fast and it's hard to play. We're inevitably going to have a lot of Duane focus here as we talk about this record. But like the choices that Dickie Betts made, his influence not only can't be understated, but it's also worth its own exploration further down the Allman Brothers track. Allman Brothers track. There you go.
And and the other guy said after Duane died, you would almost think, because of all the origin story we've been telling, that it would become Greg's band, but like stylistically, it became Dickie's band. He was at the core of the thing. Certainly from the 71 to 73 or 74, Brothers and Sisters that's a Dickie Betts record above all. And again, that 6-pointed star thing had evaporated, and then not long after that they lose Barry Oakley, like 10 blocks from where Duane died, which is crazy. But again, I think it's good to emphasize we chose the self-titled because it would never be this perfect 190 proof White Lightning blues thing that was, to understand Duane Allman, this was the most perfect the Duane Allman ideology ever got. Maybe not in the recording and the production, but this is a document to understanding all of these things that came together and would eventually become this other thing. But what it was in this moment was really special.
That's why all that backstory is worth it, because it even in hearing the story and reading it over and over, it feels like this was the thing that Duane had been holding in his entire life.
That's right. You made an interesting point about the tempos of the songs alternating. I think it's interesting that it speeds up toward the middle with Black-Hearted Woman, and then Trouble No More, which was the jam that kind of started it all. Really does the Muddy Waters thing justice. And in the 1973 mix, you can hear more of the acoustic attack. There's more clarity in like the playing, and there's a cleaner, more muscular bass tone. You really get the joy of Barry Oakley and listening to that one. But far and away, if you talk about anything on this record, the 2 things are Dreams and Whipping Post. Whipping Post to me is the most important rock and roll song. Say what you will about Stairway or Freebird or Do You Feel Like We Do or any Hendrix or whatever. Like Whipping Post has its place in the pantheon. And if maybe you don't want to call it the best rock and roll song ever, it's like the best post-blues song.
Please turn the page. You've reached 1/3 of the way through this podcast episode. Now for the remaining 2/3, we will talk about Dreams and Whipping Post.
We'll be back next time for part 2.
These 2 songs alone could have been their own EP and could have gone down in history.
And I'd still want to cover it if it was just these 2 songs. So both of these written by Greg, right? Greg talked about how he showed up with 22 songs that they asked him to go off and write. Greg, a great songwriter, prolific songwriter. In the first batch of stuff, they were like, nah. But he had this slow, mournful B3 organ song in Dreams. And then he had this slow, dirgy, mournful blues song in Whipping Post. And one stayed, the former kind of stayed what it was and was flourished. Flourish was built around it by the rest of the guys, and then Whipping Post was changed significantly from the form Greg originally intended it. So Dreams, I think, to start there, if there's one song you got to have headphones for on this record, it's this one. In the remix, and again, if you're looking for these, we'll share them in the thread, but the way to find the remix version is to search for Allman Brothers Band Deluxe or to search for Beginnings. And it'll say, I think, on the track titles like 1973 Beginnings mix. So in Dreams, you can hear, if you're really paying attention, the dynamics of the drum hits on both sides, right? When they're swelling the song up, you can hear them physically hitting harder, and you can hear when they bring it back down. The solo is really the thing about this song. And I love the story of Duane was trying to get it right. They had pretty much everything down cold except for the solo in Dreams. And he couldn't get it right. And then basically came in and played the same thing he'd been playing, but with slide, and made everybody in the studio cry. Just one of those moments that took everybody's breath away.
Like, literally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not an exaggeration.
And you talked about that rhythm too. I think it's good to point out there, this was like Dreams was their palette for all the jazz that they've been consuming, right? And so specifically to your point about the rhythm, both the JMO's percussion and the bass line are taken directly from Miles Davis's All Blues. They're bluesing jazz songs at this point and then putting them together, and then Duane is doing that on top of it.
So the slide solo is really powerful when you're listening to it with your full attention, but the organ puts it in this nice sonic basket. Like, it underpins it really nicely. And there's a rhythm guitar lick that I hadn't really ever heard until I was listening, but in the right channel, really tastefully, there's like a clean tone guitar lick. And that's such an essential little piece to the whole thing. It's just such a warm blanket of blues, man. That song absolutely kills. I say that, and then immediately after that is Whipping Post, right? This is the Allman Brothers Band Voltron at max power. I would fail to try to describe it, but it's, of other things we've talked about on this podcast, it's the halfway point between I've Been Loving You Too Long and that moment where Otis says, "You are tired," and holds that note, and all of the bombast of Stairway. Mash those two things together, and you got this overdriven blues song that was arranged in this way by Barry Oakley. So they had the basic idea. Barry Oakley stopped the rehearsal cold and was like, let me workshop this. I'll be back tomorrow. Came back with the bass line that we now know and love today. And I think this is the part where we got to just drop it in and let it ride for a second.
Stairway gives an interesting way to view parts of this song. God help us, we should never do a which song is better type thing. So just think of it as a way to compare some of the things that are happening in this song. So with Stairway, clearly, right, it builds, even timing wise, where they start messing with time signatures, and it builds towards the guitar solo, which in and of itself builds to the apex. And so the apex of Stairway is that moment where, like, all of a sudden at the end of the solo, Jimmy Page goes really high up on the fretboard, the chord progression changes, the rhythm changes, Robert Plant comes back in, and it's supposed to be like a mountainous type feeling of, and we've gone up and now we're back down. Everything in Whipping Post, almost everything on this album, is in service of the moment where they completely drop out and only Greg comes back in.
Yep. Good Lord, I feel like I'm dying.
Oh, take that again and think about, as we talked about earlier, when Greg first comes in on It's Not My Cross to Bear, it's similar in the sense of, yeah, there was a pause right before then and now it's Greg. But like, here's the moment where it's been building and building, and essentially the entire band lays what would become their most well-known song at the feet of Greg. Like, it is all on Greg at that moment to make the connection between the song that just stopped and the vamp that's about to pick back up. Yeah, I can almost feel somebody listening to this being like, that's some professional ass overthinking of the song. But like, that's blues. Like, drawing the tension until it becomes desperate feeling, and until like the silence in the song feels like a void, and then something shouts through it similarly, like just like Otis would do, right? Like you said, it's such a powerful moment. Yeah.
It's catharsis is the thing. The other vocal thing to note is the bridge right before they cut out for the last Sometimes I Feel. He's just screaming. He's howling. It's visceral, right? It's just pure of the moment, visceral feel. And the remix tamps down the rasp of it a good deal. But whereas he's not going in the red in the mix on this one, it cuts through better. So you definitely want to hear it in the original mix, because it's like a little bit blown, like just slightly blown out, and that contributes to the urgency of the song. I love thinking of it as White Lightning. Like, it's just White Lightning feel. It's the purest, raw, uncut blues feeling that you can get anywhere.
It's such a story. Greg wrote the song on an ironing board with the burnt end of matches because he didn't have a pin. Just like,
that's the blues, man.
Oh,
and I loved the stories that came out when Greg Allman unfortunately passed. Killer Mike, who we have mentioned a number of times on this podcast, local hero. This is apparently one of his all-time favorite songs, and he can cite the lyrics the same way that he would Shook One's Part 2, because it's just in the canon. And apparently he will listen to this sometimes before they go out and do Run the Jewels shows, like to tap into the most primal place of feeling and human connection.
If you're a Southerner, if you're a Southerner, you know what a whipping post is. But I've been run down. I've been lied to. I don't know why. I let that mean woman make a fool. She took all my money, wrecks my new car. Now she's with one of my good time buddies. They're drinking at some crosstown bar. Come on, man. Like, who, if that's not the blues, what is? Like, as a man, I like to feel like I've been an alpha male in every relationship. And, man, if my wife left me today, I'll be curled up in a corner, crying. You know what I'm saying? And I know, as a man, you don't know what it feels like to hurt till you've been heartbroken, man. And the blues let you know that. Like, think about when you hear Sometimes I Feel. Lord, I feel like I'm dying. Like I've been tied to the whipping post. Good Lord, I feel like I'm dying. I felt like that. Me and my wife went through a hard part. She wasn't a woman running around on me. I made some wrong decisions at some point in our marriage, and man, she put me out.
To the point you were making earlier, the power of music, like the Holy Spirit of the thing at the dead center. This is that. You're not going to land any closer on the thing that is the reason we all keep coming back to music than the thing at the center of Whipping Post.
One of my favorite quotes from anybody in the band at the time was from Greg describing the intro, though, to that song. As you mentioned, like there were some iterations of it, and then there was just a lot of excitement about a total rearrangement. And the intro is, depending on who you talk to, in like an 11/4 or 11/8 time signature. The Allman Brothers, pretty classically throughout this whole album, will introduce weird time signatures, and they never quite really feel like they're in an odd time signature because they do a great job of dropping it into a 4/4 at some point.
Yeah. Phil Walden talked about playing jazz structures and blues ways, like the swinging feel was their thing.
Yeah.
They flattened it into groove always.
Just to give you an idea, though, of like, this wasn't a high intellectualism type of thing. This was an extraction with honor and respect. So Greg would talk about that intro later, and he said, I didn't know the intro was in 11/4. I just count it. And he basically goes on. You could tell he's probably having a good time during this quote because he just goes on to try to describe how he counts numbers. But then he's like, I didn't think of it that way. I thought of it more like 1, 2, 3, 1. So anyway, but he goes through and describes it. But he talks about when this intro was written and that Greg started playing along with it and everything. And that Dwayne said, man, that's good. I didn't know that you would understand 11/4. And Greg says, of course, I said something intelligent back to him like, what's 11/4? And Dwayne said, okay, dumbass, I'll draw this up on a piece of paper for you so you can play it. And like just the little moment of like brother, just like brother to brother.
I'm going to fill a pillowcase full of bars of silk and beat the shit out of you.
From these guys who are investing in this like emotionally distraught howling moment. You still can't rip the family out of anything like that.
Right. It's just about playing for feel for them. It's not necessarily about the like blues agony of it. It was just the voice of the vocabulary that they knew to try to play with feeling. It does ultimately, though, come back to Dwayne and his vision, and there are so many reverent quotes around him from his bandmates. Butch Trucks saying he was capable of reaching inside people and pulling out the best, to your point about what he was just saying about Greg. He made us all realize that music will never be great if everyone doesn't give it all they have, and we all took on that attitude. Why bother to play if you're not going all in? But then my favorite one was Dickie Betts, right? His true counterpoint, and they would go out every night and try to outdo each other and push each other to new heights. He said, it says a lot that Dwayne's hero was Muhammad Ali. He had Ali's type of supreme confidence. If you weren't involved in what he thought was a big picture, he didn't have time for you. A lot of people really didn't like him for that. It's not that he was aggressive. He was more of a super positive, straight ahead, I got work to do kind of thing. If you didn't get it, see you later. He always seemed like he was charging ahead, and it took a lot of energy to be with him. And that energy is on full display in this record.
I think it's worth noting, too, because the Allman Brothers caught fire after at Fillmore East, and that's where I think Whipping Post started to get the appropriate amount of attention.
Right. A 23-minute version of it or whatever.
Which is good. But I just want to make sure anyone who's listening to this who hasn't heard the original version goes back and really, really listens to the original. This is one of those, I think, rare situations where a live version of Whipping Post draws out a version of the song that doesn't exist otherwise, and it's great.
Yep.
To me, I wonder how much you're going to hate me for this. John Mayer plays Gravity at the end of all of his sets now, and it's just such a good, solid blues palette.
Yep.
And it's a really different song from the original.
I'm alone with a bed.
Okay.
A few years ago.
I hear you.
You've won me over. Like, I get it. He's a great guitar player.
Well, so in contrast to that, where the original of Gravity, it's good, but it's not at all the same song that he plays now. It's different here. The original of Whipping Post contains a concentrated version. It's like a cold brew of Whipping Post on this album, and it's so worth listening to over and over in its original form. It stands alone, and it should continue to stand alone and apart from virtually every white blues song that came out then or afterwards.
I'm still surprised that anyone listens to this podcast, but I try to think, okay, if this makes any kind of a difference, if this makes a dent in any music fan's life, what are the specific things that maybe we were able to achieve as a result of getting together and getting each other excited about these things? if one person ever in my life tells me, I can't believe I've never heard Whipping Post before, it's one of the greatest songs I've ever heard, and I'm telling everybody I know about it, I'll just straight up go ahead and punch my own ticket, because that's it. I did my good earthly deed, and I had a real good run. And when you deliver my eulogy, ultimately, I want you to tell that story. So I hope that above all, you spend some time with Whipping Post. I think there are other places that you can go after that. I think you absolutely should listen to Fillmore East. So crazy that this wild live record with 20 and 30-minute song lengths, like entire sides of an LP, were the record that made this band break out, speaks to what a tour de force they were live. Some other things that we didn't really want to touch on because they get beyond the scope of this moment, this intersection of factors, is Duane's playing in Derek and the Dominoes. We have our feelings about Eric Clapton, but he's almost universally regarded as one of the best guitar players of all time, certainly integral with his work with Cream and his solo stuff. But Derek and the Dominoes, if you are a rock and roll fan, you know Layla, certainly. But there's a record called the Layla Sessions, a later reissue, and there's a 5-part jam in there that's just he and Eric. It gets to the core of how they really pushed each other and how Duane was so good he became peers with one of his heroes. So Jam 1 through Jam 5 on the Layla Sessions are worth a listen. Some other directions, just 3 more I want to touch on. One is Sea Level. So J-Mo really went down more the jazz fusion route in the later 70s and beyond. J-Mo has continued to find and be inspired by new groups of musicians his whole career. We will share the New York Times article where he was interviewed. He is really the remaining spiritual leader of the band and the idea of the band now. But Sea Level was a jazz fusion group who released on Capricorn, J-Mo on drums, Chuck Leavell, who played with the Allmans briefly, but has since been the Rolling Stones keyboardist, their key guy. They would cover some Allman Brothers stuff live, notably Hotlanta, which is the only instance of you ever being able to say Hotlanta and not getting slapped in the face.
Factually correct.
For it. Then this was a late-breaking addition in our research. Johnny Jenkins, if you look at the Duane Allman anthology of like stuff that he recorded with this guy Johnny Jenkins, who was the band leader of the Pine Toppers, who was the first group to hire Otis Redding as a singer. So that's Johnny Jenkins' claim to fame. It was originally intended as a Duane solo album before Allman Brothers Band. He played most guitar tracks, and Jenkins later supplied vocal tracks. And Duane, Barry Oakley, J-Mo, and Butch Trucks were all on this record. And it's all covers. And the title, Tonton Macoute, I'm sure I'm saying that wrong because I'm not Creole.
I enjoyed it, though.
Translates roughly in Haitian Creole to Bogeyman and was the nickname for Papa Doc's secret police in Haiti in the 50s. But it's this killer like Dr. John meets Muscle Shoals. It's funky. If you want a little bit of a counterpoint to the Duane thing or the Allman Brothers thing, Lowell George was a Duane of sorts. He's a mega talent. He died at 34, but he was California born and steeped in New Orleans funk. In fact, he joined the Meters to back Robert Palmer on an album once. So this sort of like racial fusion, cultural fusion thing was at its best when he was in Little Feat on the 74 record Feats Don't Fail Me Now, because we'll probably never cover that record on the podcast. And I think it's one of the best other examples of this like funk, blues, all that. I want to call that out. So we have some definite places for you to go if you dig this at all. And we do a varying degree of job at sending you other places once you've been here. But fortunately, there are a bunch of places other than like Skynyrd and Marshall Tucker where the Allmans unlocked a Rosetta Stone for mixed culture, stylistic blending that was done really uniquely and effectively.
Sending out people in 18 different individual directions is the only way we can possibly convince ourselves to stop talking about this record for any amount of time.
That's right. Please leave the room now. or we're just going to keep talking until you kill us.
I need to smoke a carton of cigarettes because this has both been enjoyable and it's stressful to stop.
Go to tunedig.com for your chance to win a free vinyl copy of the album we just covered. And follow us on Instagram and Twitter for even more info about the album, including playlists, links to interesting articles and videos, and even some stories that didn't make the episode. Most importantly, though, please support your favorite local record store or concert venue, or buy merch from a band you love. Thanks for listening.